Here's something almost nobody tells you about that saying, and once you hear it, I don't think you'll ever hear the phrase the same way again. It used to be a compliment. If you have ADHD, that phrase probably doesn't feel like a random saying. It feels like a diagnosis, because you know exactly what it's describing. The 6 hobbies you've picked up and mostly put down. The degree that doesn't quite match the career you're building. The bookshelf with 4 different subjects on it, none of them finished, all of them loved at some point with your entire chest. The app still on your phone from courses you were completely obsessed with for 11 days straight. You know this phrase. It's basically your autobiography, narrated by someone who clearly wasn't rooting for you. Centuries ago, being called a jack of all trades wasn't an insult at all. It was praise. It meant you were resourceful, capable, the kind of person who could fix a wagon wheel, patch a roof, treat a small wound, and negotiate a fair trade, all in the same week without needing to call in 4 different specialists to do it. In a world where survival depended on adaptability, a jack of all trades wasn't someone who failed to commit. He was someone worth having around, precisely because he wasn't limited to just one thing. The master of none part got tacked on later by people who wanted to take the compliment down a notch. And that's the version that stuck, the shortened, slightly cruel version, the one that gets said about people like us with a knowing little smile. But there's a piece that's usually left off entirely, one that most people have never even heard, one that flips the entire meaning back around. The saying in full goes like this: Jack of all trades, master of none, though oftentimes better than master of one. Read that again. Better than master of one. Because here's the truth that got quietly erased along with that last line. In a world that's messy, unpredictable, constantly changing, deep expertise in exactly one narrow lane isn't always the advantage people assume it is. The specialist is incredible when the exact problem they trained for shows up. But real life rarely hands you the exact problem you trained for. Real life hands you a mess of overlapping, unexpected problems, and the person who can move across 5 different skill sets, connect them, adapt on the spot, is often the one who actually gets the whole thing solved. That's not a lesser kind of intelligence. That's an entire different, and honestly underrated, kind of genius. If you have ADHD, I want you to think about your scattered interests differently starting today. Not as a list of things you failed to finish. As a toolbox you've been quietly filling your entire life. Every hobby you picked up and eventually moved on from wasn't wasted. It handed you something before you left. The photography phase taught you to actually see light and composition. The cooking phase taught you to improvise under pressure with whatever's in the fridge. The half-finished coding course taught you to think in systems. The poetry you write at 1 a.m. taught you how to say hard things gently. None of that disappeared just because you didn't turn any single one of them into a lifelong career. It just got folded into the toolbox, waiting for the exact moment it would actually matter. Because that's the other thing about this kind of brain. It doesn't collect interests randomly. It collects them like it's preparing for something it can't fully explain yet, gathering tools long before it knows which job it's actually going to need them for. Think about how many of those half-finished chapters actually snuck their way into who you are today without you ever crediting them properly. The 3 months you spent obsessed with graphic design taught you an eye for how things should look before you ever needed it for a thumbnail or a resume. The short-lived gym phase taught you something about discipline that quietly transferred somewhere else entirely. Even the video games you got hyperfixated on for a summer probably taught you pattern recognition or problem-solving you've used 100 times since without noticing where it came from. Nothing in that toolbox is ever really wasted. It's just unlabeled, sitting there until the day you reach for it without even remembering where you first picked it up. I know the shame of the unfinished thing is real though, and I don't want to skip past that either. There's a specific ache in remembering how excited you were on day 1 of something, and then feeling that excitement quietly evaporate by week 3, and wondering if you're even capable of sticking with anything at all. I've felt that so many times I've lost count. But here's the reframe that actually helped me. You didn't abandon that thing. You extracted exactly what you needed from it, and then your brain, correctly or not, decided it was time to move to the next lesson. Sampling isn't the same as failing. A chef who tastes 20 dishes before perfecting one isn't indecisive. She's building a palette nobody who only ever cooked one recipe will ever have. I think about my own path constantly through this lens. This channel started, stopped, restarted more times than I'd like to admit. A bachelor's degree finished in a way that looked nothing like anyone else's straight, tidy path through it. A master's degree starting now that has almost nothing to do with half the things I've spent years obsessed with along the way. On paper, that might look like scattered, unfocused, unfinished. But every single piece of it taught me something the next piece needed. The writing, the talking to a camera, the research, the stubbornness of restarting something for the 5th time instead of quietly letting it die. None of that was wasted just because it didn't all point in one straight, obvious direction. Think about who actually thrives in the real world, outside of the neat categories textbooks like to sort people into. Small business owners, who have to be part accountant, part marketer, part therapist for their own anxiety, part everything, all before lunch. Parents, who need medical knowledge and financial planning and conflict resolution and 100 other skills, often on the same random Tuesday. Emergency responders, who can't afford to only know one thing when the situation in front of them refuses to stay inside one category. Entrepreneurs. Freelancers. Anyone building something from nothing. The world doesn't actually run on narrow specialists alone. It runs quietly, constantly, on people who can do a little bit of everything well enough to keep the whole thing moving when it matters most. You were never behind for being one of those people. You might have just been training for a version of value the world doesn't always know how to name properly. Here's something worth noticing too. The specialist and the generalist aren't actually competing for the same job most of the time. A surgeon needs to know one thing extraordinarily well, and you should absolutely want that kind of narrow mastery when you're the one on the table. But that same surgeon usually needs a whole team around her who can adapt, communicate, solve unexpected problems, and hold 10 moving pieces at once. Depth wins in the operating room. Breadth wins almost everywhere else. In almost every messy, unpredictable, real situation, life actually hands you outside of one controlled specialty. You were never failing to become a specialist. You might have just been built for the wider, messier, more necessary role most people don't even realize is a role at all. Alhamdulillah, I don't think a mind built like this was ever a mistake either. I believe Allah made some people for depth in one place, and some people for breadth across many, and both were placed here on purpose, because both are needed to keep this world actually functioning. Your curiosity was never a character flaw. It might be exactly the shape your usefulness was always meant to take. So the next time somebody says jack of all trades, master of none, with that little smirk, that little pity in their voice, I want you to finish the sentence for them. Out loud if you're brave enough. Quietly to yourself if that's all you need in that moment. Though oftentimes better than master of one. Say it like you mean it, because you've earned every word of it. Every unfinished hobby, every hyperfixation that came and went, every scattered, chaotic, beautiful skill sitting in your toolbox right now, waiting for the exact moment it turns out to be exactly what was needed. Nobody handed you that toolbox. You build it, piece by piece, one abandoned obsession at a time, usually while quietly convinced you were failing the entire time you were building it. You weren't failing. You were just early to a version of the story where all those pieces finally connect. You're not behind. You're not undisciplined. You're not failing at being one thing. You've just been building a toolbox most people will spend their whole lives without. So carry it proudly. Every strange, half-finished, wildly overqualified for nothing in particular piece of it. See you in the next one.